Hi, I'm Abigail Hirsch. This is my Teaching Students with a Disability final project, going over all of the different types of disabilities and struggles that students may have that we learned about over the course of the summer semester, and how to teach those students, which it was interesting for me because going into music education, it's a whole different kind of teaching style anyway. So this course really challenged me in what way I'm going to do that. So we'll go ahead and get started with behavioral disorders and ADHD. Before we jump right into those, I'd like to kind of go over what we learned this semester. We started by making a presentation over the complete history of special education, and we started with things when we went from no type of special education and no way for these students to be more understanding of topics and things to where schools were made for those with mental disabilities, learning disabilities. We had schools for the blind, all of those kinds of things that kind of came about, and slowly we got to where we are today, where we have more classrooms, paraprofessionals, we have different kind of models. Differentiated learning is what we talked about, and that's a thing that we are now able to understand that each student needs an individualized type of education for that. And so there is that difference in approach as we go forward. So we'll go ahead and start with emotional disabilities. Emotional disabilities, there are multiple characteristics that a child has to have. They need to have one or more of these characteristics, in order to be diagnosed with emotional disability. Things like they can't learn, they can't build relationships, inappropriate behavior in normal situations. They have the internal feelings of depression or anxiety or unhappiness. There's also physical symptoms that can come along with these problems. So then we have the internal versus the external. So if a student is emotionally disabled, externally they will be disruptive, they can be considered annoying, aggressive, and non-compliant if you give a direction. Internally they can be withdrawn, they can have depression, they can be fearful, they can have anxiety, and all of those things can work at the same time, and that really works against the student. And so these leads to, all of these can lead to anxiety, which is one of the internal causes we talked about, misconduct in your classroom, and then the classroom situations we'll have to kind of figure out. So I feel like if that were to happen in my band room and I was, made aware, because there are students who just, they have an attitude, but they aren't considered to be emotionally disabled. For students that are emotionally disabled, I feel like you have to approach the situation a little more gently. You need to discuss it more, but they still need to find there is some kind of consequence. But you also don't want to make the internal issues worse. So that's that fine line. I feel like if that was happening in my classroom, it'd be one of those one-on-one conversations you need to talk about and go to. Next, we'll go to ADHD. And with ADHD, the definition of it is limited attention, which can also include like heightened alertness in class to outside stimuli. So a student can be sitting in class and there can be a noise off to the side, and that's really going to distract them and make their learning more difficult. 7% of children have ADD or ADHD, and typically boys are 3 times more likely to have this. There is a difference between ADD and ADHD. ADD refers to mainly the attentiveness, while ADHD is considered the hyperactive type. So the difference is, with the inattentiveness of ADD, there's careless mistakes, they can't seem to listen or focus, they struggle with organization, they're distracted, forgetful, their daily routine, they'll follow it one day and the next day they can't remember what they were supposed to be doing. With ADHD, they can be very active with their hands. They can't keep their hands to themselves. They want to touch other students, mess with other students. They can't sit. They're usually loud, talking a lot, blurting out answers, and interrupting. So it's a lot more disruptive than ADD typically is, and it not only hinders the student themselves, but those around them. So that's another hard one. And we talked about the different medications that are there, but not every parent sees that as an option, and that's fine. That's the choice of a parent to decide what to do in those situations. But in a classroom setting, same kind of thing as the emotional. You're going to have to sit down. Personally, I feel like, especially in a band room, because everything makes noise. It's not just a student making noise while people are writing. A student can crash something, hit something, blow in something, and everything's going to make noise. So that's even more distracting. And I feel like the thing that's going to have to go with that is you don't want to threaten a student by saying, if you don't stop, you're going to be kicked out, because then that's exclusion, and they don't get the same opportunities as everyone else because they have this disability. So I feel like this would be another one-on-one situation, even meeting with the parents to discuss options and ask them, what do you do in your home that helps, and then apply those to the classroom, so that way they have the same ideas between home and school and understand that this is what they do in both places and it applies to both. Next we'll be going to intellectual disabilities and autism. Intellectual disabilities formerly was referred to as mental retardation. That word, typically now when people use it, it's derogatory. It's not a medical term. And so in 2010, President Obama changed it to intellectual disability. It doesn't sound quite as derogatory or harsh. The definition of it is that an individual has an IQ lower of 70. About 6.8% of students between the ages of 3 and 12 have intellectual disabilities. 49% of those students are in regular classes. They aren't separated. So the majority of those students will be within a classroom with students who don't struggle as much. And so you really have to be able to find a nice middle ground for all students to learn on. An intellectual disability itself is Down syndrome can be considered an intellectual disability. That's when an individual has their extra chromosome. Accommodations that are typically given are, dictated response, extended time. They get their tests out loud, but the problem is that's not really how a band room is run. We don't have written tests. Sometimes there are. There's not extended time because there is no test. Things like that. So I feel like what this would come down to is the playing test. Is instead of recording it, sending it in, maybe I have them come in to me and we go over and explain, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to change, and kind of go back and forth. For autism, we had the assignment looking at the IRIS model, and we picked a student that had autism. Now, autism is a communication struggle. Social interaction is hard for them. There's a lot of repetitive behavior, fidgeting, different things. And there's different severities. There's students who are high functioning, and it's hard to tell that they have this disability, and other students who aren't verbal. So there's a wide span of autism. For my student that I picked was Finn. He is a middle school boy, and that's kind of the age that I'll be working with in a band room. So I picked him for that reason. And Finn is highly functioning. He has lots of friends. He communicates well. He does struggle, but he's not nonverbal. And then his main problem was switching from an activity he liked, like using his iPad, to something he didn't like reading. He really struggled between the two, and that was when anger would be shown. So when we were reading, I think the best way for me to do it is if I'm switching from a piece to an exam, or a playing test to something else, I find which the student likes, and I'd like to be able to have them give me a hand signal that they need a break, they're overwhelmed, that this isn't something they enjoy. And so instead of getting angry and being forced to participate, this way they can sit and decide what works best for them. It's not exclusion, it's not favoritism, it's not you pick what you want because you're the student. It's the way to get them to be involved without feeling overwhelmed. Next, we'll move on to traumatic brain injury and hearing impairments. Traumatic brain injury is caused by an outside force, a hit to the head, and it usually means that the individual has been unconscious for an extended amount of time. They have to relearn things, different types of things like that. So I think the key with this one is patience, whether it's a normal classroom, whether it's a band room. I think what's really going to change is if I have a student who's a top-notch instrumentalist, they're a top-notch trumpet player, and then they have a traumatic brain injury, and they come back and they have to relearn, I can't be frustrated. It's not their fault. I can't try to force them to quickly learn back where they were. I think it's going to take patience and time to be able to find that groove again as they progress, and that comes with time. Hearing impairments, they can be any kind of hearing loss, whether it's complete deafness, if they have a cochlear implant, if they have none. they're hard of hearing. There's lots of different levels of hearing impairment. How does that work with band since you have to listen? It's difficult, but I read a lot of articles about this, that students with hearing impairments typically feel the vibrations more, and so they're really good percussionists for that reason. Because instead of having to figure out a buzzing noise and figure out how fast to buzz to get a high note on a trumpet versus a low note, they're able to feel the beat and move on with that. I do know from personal experience that it is possible to play one of these instruments even with that struggle. My aunt was born complete hearing loss in one side and partial hearing loss in the other, but she was able to do band and she played trumpet throughout, and with that she was able to do it. It just took more time and listening, and there's a lot of head adjustment, things like that. So I think the other part is not only finding the right instrument and placement in the band room, but if I have a student who has hearing impairments and they get first chair, I need to put first chair where they're comfortable being able to listen. So I feel like that's the key. And finally, we had vision impairments in gifted students. With vision impairments, it's not just total blindness. There's age. There's the cause of the blindness through age. There's glaucoma. There's cataracts. There's partial blindness. There's extreme blurred vision. There's different things, just like there's with the hearing impairment. So I talked to my band director about this because he had a student come in who is musically gifted but is blind. So I had emailed him and asked him, and he said that it's really hard because they can listen, but not all students have that innate ability to just pick up and play what they hear. So there are Braille books on music topics, and you can find the essential elements in Braille, which is really interesting, but that's a whole other learning curve. So I think the key to that is make that accessible, but also make it to where I understand it, and I have to learn it myself. So it would take more time for me as well to make sure the student feels involved and that they are able to participate. Lastly, our gifted students. Gifted students are those that, they're accelerated, and typically they're in those gifted programs that are for enrichment and accelerated learning. I think the real struggle here is that these students, because they have so much going on or they're intellectually ahead of everyone, they can get bored. And I think the boredom is key. And so I feel like the way to do this is to challenge these students in a way to where they don't get bored, but they don't feel like they're being singled out. So I think the best way to do it is, offer them, hey, if you want, you can try this section, or you could play this solo, or I would love to have you audition for this. I think the real one is just getting them involved in ways that they feel comfortable, but also to where they're staying stimulated to the point that they need to be. And that is my overview of the semester. I think that the thing I've taken away the most is the differentiated learning on how to create lesson plans individualized for students, and I look forward to putting that into play next year.